From the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame. The game of women's basketball has changed a lot since I wrote the 1901 Spalding Rulebook. You need to visit the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame in Knoxville, where they celebrate the past, present, and future of the women's game. So much to see and do. Cheers, Senda Berenson.
How do we disrupt the way people are used to being brought this information? Disrupt the way people are used to being brought this information. Brought this information. My name is Ashtin Berry. My pronouns are her, she, hers, and I live in New Orleans, Louisiana. I don't know that I can pinpoint when activism started for me. I lived in a very active home and in a very activated home. My mother really has influenced the way that I show up in the world, and specifically, I would say, in the lane of activism. They were a sexual educator, and that really influenced the way that I think about how we relate to each other, speak to each other, talk to things. Even though it was never direct or explicit from her, caring for other people was a framework that existed in our house and was often talked about. Disrupt. It wasn't something that I need to internalize as Ashtin Berry is a disruptor, but that it was a tool that I could extend for things that I think needed to be stated or what, and disruption doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be violent. It can be soft. It can be silent. And I think a lot of my 20s were spent learning how to finesse that tool. I think we think of radicalness as this extreme tension that is always coincided with pain. And I'm interested in what does radical frameworks and things look like when it has joy? And what does it look like when pleasure is something that's also attainable? I named Radical Exchange that name not because I thought that the business was actually radical, but I realized in order to open the business that I wanted to open, which would be radical, I needed a bandwidth stretched. And there needed to be space to name what radical looked like within the hospitality realm. And it needed to be a framework to get people to get used to hearing the word radical on their tongue, to get used to assessing what is normative, what is radical, and what's the spectrum and what that looks like. And just to frame that in terms of what the business is, the business is, it's new. It's a startup. We just turned a year old. We're a year and a half old now. But we just had our second conference and we are about to turn 2 years old at the end of this year, but we are brand spanking new. And the hopes for Radical Exchange is that it becomes this full-blown creative agency. And we just launched our foundation side, which is going to be more focused on how do we care for the community of hospitality members that have bought into what we do, and even those who haven't. And then the other side of that is how do we continue to provide these experiences that state that talking about social issues, talking about justice, talking about radical frameworks doesn't need to be high risk, and it can be joyful. We can include it to be joyful. And so how do we create space to food and beverages that encompass that? And that's something that we've been working out and playing with and experimenting with the past year with private clients. And then there's something like Resist and Serve, which is completely community-based for us. And it doesn't look like other businesses. It doesn't feel like other conferences. And it has flaws. It has real structural flaws to it. But I'm okay with that, because the goal for me and the goal for, I hope people realize, it's imperfection, but that like part of being radical is also just choosing to make the leap and the jump, to know that you have the pathway. And something that Black women often are told is that you have the ability and you have the space to experiment and try without expectation that it will look like what people think it should look like. I'm really grateful to have received the Egerton Award, and what I hope to see to come in the past times is transparent systems and operations and communication about what that means for people in years to come and how that will push their work forward.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Milan. I'm the managing editor of the Southern Foodways Alliance at the University of Mississippi. And as you saw in that film by University of Mississippi MFA recent graduate Zaire Love, Ashtin Berry is the winner of the SFA's 2020 John Egerton Prize. This is an award named for John Egerton, who was a founder of both the Southern Foodways Alliance and the Southern Festival of Books, an Atlanta native but longtime Nashvilleian writer, thinker, activist, whom Alice Randall will talk about a bit more in a moment. But the John Egerton Prize was first awarded by the SFA in 2009. It's awarded every year to an individual who lives in the South and whose work addresses race, class, gender, and/or social and environmental justice through the lens of food. We give this $5,000 cash prize to an early or mid-career individual who lives in the South, works in the South, applies extraordinary creativity to their work, has the power to make a difference using food as their rubric and their lens. So we are so pleased and proud to give this award this year to Ashtin Berry. And we are here today. We thank the Southern Festival of Books for partnering with us. We're here today to talk with Ashtin Berry, with Alice Randall, someone that I think everybody in the SFB audience knows, and her newest book, which I've just finished reading and enjoying, is Black Bottom Saints. Many of you probably watched her session on Friday night. And then Connor Towne O'Neill, whose first book, Down Along with That Devil's Bones, A Reckoning with Monuments, Memory, and the Legacy of White Supremacy, is just out this month from Algonquin Books. So Connor is with us in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Alice in Nashville, and Ashtin, New Orleans resident, I believe, is in Vermont right now. Excuse me?
I just said I confirmed that.
Oh, okay. So we are going to have a talk about everything from monuments and memory to cocktails and caretaking. And we thank you so much for joining us. I'd like for us to start with Alice, if you'll speak a little bit about John Egerton, about the SFA and SFB collaboration, and sort of link the legacy from Egerton to Ashtin Berry.
Thank you, Sara. Yeah, come on. It's a pleasure to be here, but it's also, we are in a very difficult and crucial moment in our nation's history, a moment that John did not live to see, but worked in many complicated ways to get us toward, if we understand it, to be a moment of reckoning. John Egerton, as we know, was born in Atlanta in 1935. He died in Nashville in 2013. I knew John from about 1983 until he died in 2013. He wrote deliberately and deeply about the South into which he was born. The prologue of Speak Now Against the Day, the generation before the civil rights era movement in the South, one of my favorite of his books, was published in 1994. And we are well served to remember the opening, that prologue, in which he dissected the day and place of his birth. It is a whole foreshadowing in a complex way of what white privilege is, but it was so much more than that. He dissects the day and the place of his birth, a segregated hospital in Atlanta, as the beginning of an intimate accounting of the ways he had been touched by and had benefited from a system elegantly designed simply, and John never forgot the simple parts, to hold Black people back. Woven into every line of Speak Now Against the Day is a shocking and shamed awareness of American hypocrisy. Every institution John founded, the Southern Foodways Alliance, the Southern Festival Books, every time he used the word Southern, he was writing Black people into that story. He didn't actually live long enough to do more than a little bit of writing brown people into that story but he was writing Black people into that story with every institution he founded, every sentence he wrote, every biscuit he baked, every biscuit he served, ate, or documented was an attempt to close a very particular gap. The distance between the rights established and celebrated in our founding documents and the lived experience of Black Americans in the South. 2020 has been a horrible year. Breonna Taylor was killed March 13th, 2020. George Floyd died May 25th, 2020. And I will just stop here and say that one of the things that John would have appreciated, because John appreciated a great story, and he appreciated the power of storytelling. And it was in a imagined conversation I had with John about George Floyd that I really came to understand part of what happened, how America came to see this as a new Emmett Till moment in the 21st century, is that George Floyd called Mama as he died. And when he called Mama, he was situating himself as a human being, and everyone who didn't hear that call, that policeman, was situating themselves as something less than a human being. And it was very Southern to understand that. We are in a time of reckoning that John worked toward but did not live to see. We gather together to honor the work of Ashtin Berry. And most years, we would be gathered also to honor the memory of John Egerton. But I'm a novelist, and I was a friend of John's for almost 40 years. I cooked for him. I ate with him at my daughter's grandmother's and great-grandmother's tables. He gave the eulogy for my first father-in-law. So we had an intimate relationship, and I'm going to allow myself to imagine for a moment what John might say if he was with us. I think he would say, give my time to Breonna Taylor. Give my time to George Floyd. Let the part of this hour that was intended to be a monument to me be a monument to them. Food and drink are catalysts to powerful conversations. I preach liberation theology of cornbread and bourbon. Let libations still be part of the necessary conversations of overdue reckoning. Let us reimagine ourselves, acknowledging others like Ashtin Berry, shining new and brighter lights, some of which I couldn't even imagine. And I like to say, I hope some of the fires, some of the young voices are sparking is actually fire that John helped spark, but John would be the first to acknowledge most of their light is wholly original to them. So let us do what John did, work for tomorrow, informed by yesterday, working together with joy and with Sara to make the American ideal an American reality, one plate at a time, one libation at a time. let us give the mic to Ashtin Berry, who deserves it because of her own extraordinary work that she built on nobody's back but her own mind and imagination.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't want to take up much time because I want us to get up into this conversation. But for those who don't know me, I'm Ashtin Berry. Many people in the food and beverage world know me because of Radical Exchange, which is a company that hosts Resistant Serve, which is an annual conference focused on centering the stories of the Black diaspora as it relates to food, beverage, and hospitality. But people may know me for longer than that. I've been in the industry for 15 years. And part of kind of the niche that I carved out is I'm an educator. I use my background in sociology and my background research to make operational and also just social analysis on how we can make spaces safer by looking at racial justice as a form of harm reduction and its intersection of other identities. So that's kind of my corner. But the biggest part of that is by also recounting the ways in which history has been erased from so many of the stories that we know and see and understand, and how food and beverage are also too political, whether we would like them be or to not. To look at food and beverage as purely as a source of joy puts us in a place of privilege. And so to understand how food systems, how beverage systems, probably the thing that no one talks about or no one sees, how beverage systems play a role in how people amass. For those of you who are thinking about, of course, the upcoming election, but even just about racial justice, maybe for the first time or maybe in a continued effort, I'd beg for you to think about how you look at power. And if the way that you analyze power is only from the top down, or if you consider the from those from who's sitting at power a marginalization and lack of power. And I ask you that because the hospitality industry is the most diverse, but it is also the second largest private sector. Primarily, most of the people who are in this industry are people who are going to be marginalized, not only because of lack of resources, financial resources, but also because of lack of social access or educational access. And so you have the most intersectionally marginalized cohort of workers and laborers within the industry. That includes undocumented, and it also primarily makes up women of color, whether that be Black, Caribbean, Filipina, Latina, right? All of these women are the backbones of this industry. And so I beg that when you think of hospitality, you think of, and you see their faces. Behind every great chef on a book are a million workers and laborers, not just that stop at his restaurant, but extend to the laborers in the fields. And behind every great bottle of wine is also a million Black and brown bodies who have been laboring in those fields to bring you a product that brings you pleasure. Pleasure is something that we should lean into. And it's also something that we should not be ashamed to divorce from the structural fallible systems that are problematic. That's funny. But anyways, let's get to the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Ashtin. I appreciate it. And I love to hear about your work and your words. And it's why the Egerton Committee, Ashley Graham, Edward Lee, Chuck Reese, John Simpkins, and Judith Winfrey chose you as the winner of this award. So thank you. And I do want to open up with something that you spoke to as I was reading Connor's book and Alice's book and getting to know your work better, Ashtin. I thought about how all of you do work that makes invisible stories and systems and dynamics more visible. So I want to talk a little bit about, we can all speak to this, but Connor, your work about monuments of Nathan Bedford Forrest in the South, what narratives they reveal, what narratives they hide. Let's start off talking a little bit about that. And then I think what we may do is talk a little bit about how each of your most recent works speak to these hidden narratives and making them visible.
Yeah, so like you said, the book is about 4 monuments of Nathan Bedford Forrest, and it covers the last several years of movements to try and remove them. And one of the monuments that I talk about is on the campus of Middle Tennessee State University, just a little bit south of Nashville in Murfreesboro. And I think it's important to keep in mind the ways that monuments seek to immortalize and remember a particular person, but they also, there's another side of that coin, in that remembering a certain past involves forgetting another one. And I think Murfreesboro stages that paradox really, really nicely. So on the courthouse square, as in so many places in the South, there's a Confederate soldier, and there are plenty of markers that talk about the valiant military history of Nathan Bedford Forrest, of course, leaving out the fact that he was a slave trader, an accused war criminal, the first Grand Wizard of the Klan, operated a convict leasing plantation outside of Memphis. But in the sight line of that Confederate monument on the far corner of the courthouse square is what used to be the slave market in Murfreesboro, but it's unmarked. And so I think that what's remembered and what's forgotten is incredibly important. And I think that Alice talked about a moment of reckoning, and I think we're really in one, and that reckoning, that referendum is happening on our memories. And I think it connects to what Ashtin is saying too about, we think about, some of us have the privilege to think about a bottle of wine as being solely joy, but of course to think about it only in terms of joy involves all of this forgetting, exclusion, magical thinking, that is meant to be, to the benefit of some at the expense of many others. So it's been fascinating to engage with you all and think about all the ways that our work is intersecting. But I think that duality of remembering one thing, and thus having letting that underwrite a certain worldview to the exclusion of others and the forgetting of others and other histories, I think is crucial.
And Alice, let's talk a little bit to connect your work in with Ashtin's as well. Black Bottom Saints is partially written from the perspective of a great entertainer and gossip columnist, Ziggy Johnson. The other sort of parallel main character, Colored Girl, is also a bar owner. And I loved that hospitality connection. And then each of your chapters ends with a cocktail as well. So you are playing with elevating these Black figures who in some cases are no longer remembered or celebrated in the way that they deserve to be by the mainstream. But they are celebrated first by Ziggy Johnson and then second by Colored Girl as she puts this book together and then makes cocktails that are, libations in ode to them. So I loved, as I was thinking about Black Bottom Saints and Ashtin's work in the cocktail industry. And then the three of us, when we spoke with each other the other day, talked about libations, cocktails as a form of monument.
Well, Sara, I'm glad that you noticed that CG is actually owns a bar. And so Ashtin Berry, so what my protagonist is my second protagonist actually is a Black woman working in the hospitality industry. And two of the other saints are actually, there's Thomas Bullock, who worked in country club bartending, which is a very difficult and often abusive and oppressive space for Black people, but actually offered some really interesting behind the scene power opportunities. And Bricktop, who owned bars, born in West Virginia, but owned bars in Paris, Rome, and in Mexico City. So was involved with brown and Black bartending and had encountered many different complexities but a lot of the sexual harassment and abuse issues that Black women often experience in these spaces, even when they are owners, even when they are workers, they are not immune to. In my cookbook I published, I coined the phrase from my own family history, kitchen rape. But there's such a thing that we haven't even had a chance to talk about that would go to the bar space. But so, yes, I am interested in these untold stories, and I'm interested in this particular Black Bottom Saints does celebrate hospitality workers. And I will just note, in touching on with Ashtin, that I actually made a libation today. This is called the Caramel Camelot. And I'm sending this one out to Hanson, Peter, Nat, Daniel, James, and Timothy. Because those are the Black men, we don't know their last names, that George Washington owned on his plantation in 1799, who were distilling liquor. George Washington's plantation. This is the father, and who were subject to beatings, abuse, bought and sold, brandings, all sorts of things in the creation of 11,000 gallons a year of whiskey on George Washington's plantation. And so this is to remember those men who went and their work that went into creating part of this history.
Cheers.
I'm concerned about who Ashtin's dealing with today, because we cannot raise the dead. We can honor the dead in monuments, but we cannot raise them. We've got to be concerned with the lived experience of people.
We do. Yeah, but I think we also have to, like, what I enjoy about both of you guys' work is that so often we try to build new frameworks without realizing how much intergenerational knowledge actually impacts the things that we learn, how much generational scripts impact the way we receive information, the way that we adhere to it, the way that we learn from it, and also who we believe, right, when they give us information. And so a lot of my work as a sociologist is drawing upon history to explain to people that we have to be curious about even our own mental capacity and our own ways in which we prescribe to just have these biases that tell us that the stories we are telling ourselves are inherently true because they came from people we know. And I think in Connor's book, in talking about the monuments, as someone who grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and now lives in New Orleans, those are things that I think about, right? Is that people are prescribing to a knowledge that they've been told is true. And I think that same happens when we talk about the hospitality industry. I think the difference when we begin to talk about the hospitality industry, and specifically the beverage world, is the lack of historical information that we have. And there's a lot of different reasons why we don't have historical information, but one of the reasons that we know we don't have a lot of historical information about liquor is because lack of transparency made for better financial ROI, right? And especially when you are using labor and cheap labor, tipping it is a byproduct of 1865 labor laws. And the liquor industry has always benefited from having people who are disenfranchised be the backbone and the laborers of that community. But by not having research inherently on that industry, by not having tons of resources on beverage and cocktails, right? We limit how many stories get to be told and who gets to tell them. There's a book that's on Tom Bullock that gives information. And while it's a good book, it's written by a white man who proposes a lot of different things about the Black experience that he doesn't know, right? And so who gets to tell the story and how does that story get told is also important. But also who gets left out, right? Because they weren't written in these safe little newspaper clippings or in these specific ways that researchers in academia are taught to go and research, right? And so I think the historical narrative is just as important as the current. And in terms of what's happening currently, I think that we have something that's really beautiful, which is that I'm in the midsection of the millennials. I'm kind of like I'm like not the older generation, but I'm not like the last one. I'm like right in the middle of the millennials. But as someone, it's really interesting to see from millennials and Gen Z is to see that how many of us, because lack of transparency we were given from other generations, how many of us have gone to actually find the knowledge to create our own documentation? What's beautiful, while there's lots of issues with the internet, what's beautiful about the internet, what's beautiful about Instagram, what's beautiful about TikTok is the way that everyone can document. Mm-hmm. Are the ways that maybe aren't historically the way we used to, but the ways that we have documentation and from multiple perspectives. Not just those who are in power or who have access or have the privilege of time to document. And that's something that this current day is changing. And thank you for honoring George Washington's slaves, the enslaved people who built this line. And I for everybody who hears that, I need us also to know that that's not a rarity. Well, maybe Uncle Nearest is the only name that we've heard about Jack Daniels, is that narrative in liquor is not natural. And if you think to yourself, if you ever want to sit back and think to yourself, why is it that we have so few Black winemakers? Why is it that we have so few Black distillers or distillery owners? What we need to remember is that that's not by chance, but that's by legislative, and that was purposeful. Indigenous people couldn't distill on reservations till 2018. So think about that when you talk about liberation. Think about the ways that we can't say that liquor is not political. The continent of Africa was colonized through gin.
And wine traditions and beer trends and traditions in Africa predate the colonial era. The palm wines and things of the sort, and the Côte Noire down in New Orleans actually controlled this liquor production, distilling production.
Right. Yeah. And so, well, with that, I want to also say, you say who you're drinking. I am drinking Pretty in Pink, which is from Co-Cellars, which is a cider made by Krista Scruggs, who is one of the not only few Black winemakers and cider makers in the country, but she is also one of the few who actually owns her land as well, which is really powerful. And so I'm honoring her, and I'm drinking this because there are new stories being made. There are people who are creating new narratives and new historical things, who are picking those things up. So yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find so powerful about both of y'all's work and about the conversation so far is that Alice talked about this moment of reckoning being this balance of sort of looking in both directions, looking at yesterday and tomorrow, and harnessing our understandings of how the past has shaped our present, to ask us to reform and rethink what we see. What we see in the future. And so I think that that's something that that seems to be really driving your work, Ashtin. I wonder if you could speak to that, the sort of like the way that you use the past to shape that radical imagination, and what you see when you look forward. Like what's tomorrow? What's the tomorrow you see?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I try to do that maybe my ancestors didn't have the privilege of doing, well, not all my ancestors had the privilege of doing, is I try to imagine a future where struggle isn't the thing that defines me. Mm-hmm. I try to imagine a future that asks of me as a person that is proud to be Black, is proud to be a woman, but that we're a system where those things aren't rooted in marginalization, but rooted in the experience of speaking to the fact that I'm different and like what that different perspective is. Mm-hmm. That's how I try to imagine, but I do a activity, and anybody who's watching is welcome to do it. And it's one thing that always kind of drives my innovation is that, once a week I sit down and I imagine a room, and, it could be a prompt. Sometimes I say, let's imagine you were at a bar in 2050. Or I'll say, let's imagine you were at a restaurant in 2035. Let's imagine you're in Brooklyn in 2022. Who do you see? And I sit for 5 minutes and I think of all the people I see. And then afterwards, I write them down. And afterwards, I write down all the people I see. And some of them are people I know. Some of them are not. I write down everything that I can. And afterwards, I say to myself, who is missing here? Mm-hmm. Who did you not visualize? And when I come back to that and I say to myself, I said, well, cool. That's where you lack intimacy. It is that group of people where you lack intimacy. And that lack of intimacy is what prohibits you from building that future. How are you going to get closer to that community so that you build with them in mind? I think we do a lot of restructuring. We build with intent and we don't design based on impact. And I am very interested in saying that I understand that my intentions are based on my desires. My intentions are selfish. They are based on the information that I know. And what I have to know is that no matter how great or good my intentions are, I am limited, not all. And if I know that, it means that I cannot build based on my selfish desires, but I must design for desires that I have nothing and have no clue about. And I must design with the openness that when someone comes, it doesn't cost us. We don't see it as a cost to us to build inclusion for them. Mm. Did I answer that question? Does that make sense? That was a little bit theoretical, but if you mean more literal, you know, in the future, what yeah, I'm like, if you mean more literal, but that is how I build. And I think I said it. I think I said it in the video, but I am really, a lot of people in hospitality are concerned with perfection. So much of what we do is theater and performance. And I love that. I love the fact that we get to perform for people until we don't know the difference between the performance and who we are. And I am of a big belief that presence is more important than perfection. I'm not concerned with the perfection of an experience. I am concerned with the presence of all of those involved in the experience. And as I see hospitality build, I hope more of us become more concerned with that. Our malleability for those who are in our presence rather than for the standards of governing bodies.
That was wonderful. I love that visualization exercise. And I think, I know I could use it, and I think a lot of us could, you know, this sort of acknowledgement and desire to explore blind spots that you might have and imagine how to fill them. But as I hear you talk about this, I mean, it's you know, inevitably, I'm thinking about the fact that many bars are empty right now. We can't gather in ways that we used to. And, you know, Alice, there's a lot, so many of the saints in your book are, entertainers, performers. There's a lot, you know, in your book about gathering, about theatrical performance, people at bars and nightclubs. And then Connor, you look at, protests and, you know, gatherings of people on the far right, on the left, over these monuments. And I'm thinking about how this has been a year, a 7 or so months where we really can't gather in those ways. How is this affecting how each of you think about your work, and where you see it going in the future? You know, I think a lot of us think, okay, well, when we get together again, it'll be like X, Y, or Z. You know, we try to imagine a future that is in some ways a return to the past of February 2020. And it may not be like that. What's it going to be like when we can gather again?
I don't think it will. I don't think, as my father said, as Black Detroit will tell you, when you see a clock going backward, it's broke. So anybody who is in some illusion and delusion, I will use the word, that we're getting back to what it was like before March 10th, I think that is largely a delusion and an illusion. And I think anyone who can tell you what it will be like is a charlatan promising something, ability to predict the future that no one has. Because it depends on how we exit this moment. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm in a bad, and this is a lot of quotes around me, but we are in the movie Gone with the Wind, and we're all looking at Gettysburg. There's all these eyes. We're all looking at this election. It really depends on what happens next, and then what happens after that. What does January really look like? January 22nd. I do think that some surprises that have been positive and that are interesting. We're gathered right now virtually. Mm-hmm. I have actually I'm a breast cancer survivor. I have only been out of my house maybe 6 times since March 10th. But I haven't been completely in any significant way alienated, isolated. In some ways, I've been more connected to my friends in other countries, or my friends across the country, because it now doesn't privilege the one I can go meet at my corner bar. There are some people I got to see all the time because they were walking distance to my downtown apartment. So I think we're all redefining community virtually. We're defining intimacy in different ways. In some ways, because we're right, all my students are now right in my face. I can see whether your eyes are unbalanced. I'm standing much closer to you right now than each of you. Then Connor's sitting back a little bit. He's figured that out. But actually, we sit closer to the camera, and we are in each other's intimate space. We're seeing into people's houses and apartments that we never saw into. So I think that we are going to find new ways to be intimate, new ways to be connected. And audiences, I don't know when people feel that the price of a concert, the price of a meal, that it's worth, because this thing will be handled, but living in a global world, pandemics will spread more quickly, and we all want to live in a global world. We don't want to. So I think we don't know what the future will be, but it will be different. It will be newly intimate. A few years back, we thought people who met on the internet, I've not met anyone, that was crazy and strange. Well, now a third of all marriages and significant relationships are coming from whatever this is called, cyber dating. The world is changing.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that cost-benefit analysis too. And in looking at the protest movement, I think that the Times clocked as like the biggest protest movement in the history of the country. Thinking about the urgency that is underwriting that in the context of this pandemic, and in a pandemic that is disproportionately taking the lives of people of color in this country, like thinking about the urgency that was still bringing them into the streets in such numbers, and providing the powerful images of toppling monuments, Confederate monuments, monuments of colonizers in the Southwest, Columbus. Like I'm thinking about that cost-benefit analysis and the urgency that's underwriting that, and it makes it all the more powerful and poignant that there is still that collective will that is exerting itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID, it has obviously ravaged the restaurant and bar industry specifically, and hotel industries specifically. Living in a place like New Orleans, which is so based off of tourism, and is a predominantly Black city, and has most people who work in New Orleans work in hospitality or in some adjacent industry that is dependent on the success of hospitality. Mm-hmm. And so, I think there are a lot of people in the industry and outside of the industry that want to turn back the clock, as Alice said. I think the reality is that the industry will never be the, and I think this is when history actually helps and assists us, right? The hospitality industry has been ravaged and really disrupted before, right? This isn't the first time. Prohibition did that to the industry. World War II did that to the industry. And so, World War II is where you entrance white women into hospitality, right? And so this thought process that there has never been such a rupture within the industry comes from the fact that people don't have any type of historical thing to pull on to say, well, what happened before steamboats, before restaurants and bars as a regular common thing aren't regular and something that everybody can access other than rich people until the 1950s. Before that, steamboats and hotels are how people access catering. Before that, catering within your homes. You have to remember Jim Crow, segregation, the South. There's no fine dining restaurants for Black people. Where are they going? They're entertaining in their homes. They're creating those experiences within their homes. And I think that there's a lot to be said about the ways in which in America, not just America, but all the Western world, we were outsourcing a lot of our pleasure in food and beverage access outside of our homes rather than in our homes. Specifically in the last two decades, right? The early 2000s to now. And so while I think, why I certainly want to see restaurants begin to thrive again, I think something that needs to be thought about is how many restaurants we saw operating. A thing that we haven't had an honest conversation about is the way that restaurants were operating wasn't sustainable. it didn't work. It only worked for the people at top. It only worked for owners. That is a broken system. And in every other industry, we would say that's unacceptable. But for some reason within hospitality and food systems, we think that it's acceptable to say that we don't pay people fairly, and that, you know, it would be great for us to have, you know, oh yeah, we just have to continue these businesses for the sake of having these businesses. And what I think is that we need to remember the underground economies that have always existed, especially in the South. The gas station that is not only the gas station, but acts as the food service and the grocery store. We have to remember the woman who sells every Friday gumbo, right, outside of her house. We have to remember the underground economies that have always acted within food before there were publications like Food and Wine and Bon Appetit and other things to go around and showcase and create food tourism. Food tourism is not new. It's been around. It was more localized, intimate before, and we have to get back to that.
And one of the things I think that's happening that's sort of exciting, at least in Nashville, is that some of those underground economies, that gumbo maker, or my CBD ice cream maker, who is now directly from her own house and is selling directly to her customers and not through some other sources, she may in fact be making more money, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, so many of the actual waiters and waitresses were working without health insurance, without really a living wage. And so what actually has been disrupted? I mean, and
that's the question.
There are so many in our city that wouldn't go back to work because actually for a while, some of them were making more money off of unemployment than what they were making when they were working. That should be a good call to conscience about how much they were being paid. And how do we feel about going into a restaurant? I remember after Katrina, some of the analysis of how much the people really working at Galatoire's were being paid, particularly the Black people, versus what the dinner is selling for and what the things are selling for. So I think there's some very big questions, and we need to note.
We need to know
that it goes all the way back to hospitality in America and with enslaved Africans, not just in the South, but up in New York too.
All over.
And this kind of exploitation. And so the actual Civil War was a disruption of the hospitality. The Emancipation Proclamation is still the biggest disruption of the hospitality industry we've ever had in America.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we need to note those things and ask what needs to be reformed and what are the opportunities when people eat at home for a new generation, and who got to eat in those restaurants. Because I don't know about the rest of you, but I love fine restaurants. I will have to admit, before COVID, I ate out 369 days a week here. I love restaurants. I'm a great cook. I stay with Julia Child, but I also write all these books. It's busy. I've been in restaurant days. But so many times in so many of the best restaurants, the most segregated space I enter, restaurant space. I have eaten way too many times as the only Black person in a restaurant with a lot of Black people in the kitchen.
Yep. And if not Black people, brown people, right? I think at the end of the day, the thing that we have to ask ourselves is being a business owner a right or a privilege? Because many of the specifically white men business owners in restaurants, they think the right. It's not a right. It's a privilege, right? And if your privilege comes at the expense of others, you have to morally ask yourself, is it worth it? And I think the other thing that has to happen is that we must stop adhering to things that do not serve us, that we know are not sustainable and do not work, simply because we have not done the work to search for something that is new. And many of the conversations in the restaurant hospitality, but also bringing it even back to protests, let's speak about how many business owners who employ people of color and Black people, specifically in the South, thought that it was risky to say Black Lives Matter.
Wow, yeah.
How is it that you as an owner make your living off of the labor of Black and brown people, but you find it risky to say that their lives matter? You find it risky to have a conversation about the fact that ICE can't come into your private property. You find that risky. And so I think that we have to talk about the ways that protests protest extended into the street the ways that it did because it had been building, and the people who had power to protest in ways that honestly caused them limited risk on a daily basis chose not to. I tell people all the time, the fight for justice, not just racial justice, right? Because when we talk about racial justice, we are also talking about people who are disabled. We are talking about trans people. We are talking about women. When we talk about justice, the idea that it needs to be large and sweeping is one that is built off of white supremacy culture. The ask should be, how do you daily on in micro ways commit yourself to making choices that spread and dismantle harmful systems? And I think that in the food industry, it starts with asking. Right now, there's a wave of owners who are denouncing tipping and getting rid of tipping in their spaces. That's all great and dandy, but if your workers still aren't making a livable wage, that action has been performative.
Yeah, and that goes back to the distinction you're making between the right and a privilege, Ashtin, that, I think you can extend that to a general sense of how a lot of, if I can generalize, a lot of white Americans regard the past, that this idea of American exceptionalism dictates that, like, we're the greatest country in the world. I built this, like, this is all for me. And like, there's a sort of a inevitability of progress, and that our standing is from our own hard work. And I think that one of the crucial moments of getting to a revision of that sense, understanding that place of privilege, is coming to a common understanding of our past and the things that have been convenient for us to forget, but that we need to be held accountable to, that can revise our memories and thus revise our sense of where we are now and how we got here and on whose backs, and thus, who we have a responsibility to and for. And maybe that's happening a little bit more. I don't know.
I think it is, and I think it isn't. I think it among Gen Z. Yeah, I see the thing, but I also want to say this thing that, like, there is a way that we talk about racism. There's a way that we talk about marginalization in this country that makes it one directional, that acts as if it's coming from this big bad boogeyman to people. And what we don't seem to talk about is the negative reciprocity of racism. Right? When we speak of reciprocity, we always think that it's positive. It isn't always positive. And what we don't speak about is the relationship between privilege and marginalization. Privilege doesn't just exist without any cost to any people. It does have a cost. The cost is marginalization. Mm-hmm. And I think the real conversation is, when are people who benefit, including me? I am, even as a Black woman sitting here saying I am privileged, I'm able-bodied, I am thin. I am very aware that if I was a large, darker skin, did not have phenotypical features that people are loved, was not fashionable, people would not take the things that I say the way that they take them. Mm-hmm. They would be even more upset about the things that I am saying. Right? And it's about asking ourselves where we sit on the spectrum. It's not a binary. It is an ongoing spectrum that constricts and expands based on what room we are in. And the conversation always needs to be, when we are talking about power, power is relational. Mm-hmm. It is dependent on power in relation to whom or what, a system or a group of people or an individual. And those can all be operating at once. And so I think this is where we must, as Kimberly Crenshaw said, use intersectionality as a framework to realize that our relationships, whether we acknowledge them or not, are based on a reciprocal, that's based off of a system of oppression. And so if you have privilege, you must acknowledge privilege in relation to what? An institution, a system, a person. In what ways is that privilege enacting? Because I think the biggest thing is that people think that by stating that they have privilege, or acknowledging that they have privilege, or acknowledging that they have more privilege than others, that their work starts and ends there. But it actually does nothing if you can't actually spend it.
Mm-hmm. It is a liberation aspect. It's the part where you have to actually impact another person and impact the power of that room. Have a goal and using whatever power you have to be moving towards the goal that you are setting out. I think that I agree with, it is Yeah, that these are a series of complicated transactions, and they're all relative. That they're not absolute values. What people have in any one moment and in one space, and I think that I like that you noted TikTok earlier, because I also think that it's important to notice that protest isn't just happening. Protest is also changing. Some of the most interesting disruptive protests have been people on TikTok being able to dismantle, and think about how many lives they saved by dismantling one of those early President Trump rallies. That by going on, that TikTok people, they may have, look at what happened at the Rose Garden. Think of how many lives they may have saved, even on the other side, by disrupting that protest. So I think that protest is happening in complicated and new ways. And I think that, and we have to ask all these questions about equity and not have it be so marginalized. I mean, I think about chocolate is one I like to talk about. Everyone will agree. They don't think we should have slavery in America right now, right? They don't believe in slavery. But they eat chocolate that is being harvested by children who are essentially enslaved. And one of the things I do try to do is not to do that. It does not say perfect, but at least noting it. And you can see sometimes I see people are rolling their eyes at me, but actually chocolate industry we can document internationally is one of the most exploitive issues that essentially in many cases is actually socially enslaving young people.
So is coffee.
Yes,
Coffee's another one. I mean, all of it are agricultural products, but part of American exceptionalism is assuming that you aren't part of the problem. That is actually American exceptionalism. It's the assumption that I'm not part of the problem. When that person makes that comment about an issue, it's about everyone else and not me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think holding on to the me first right now, that part, that we all have to realize that if we're in this system, we're born into an exploitive system, and we are all charged with reforming it. And I think that, and it's going to be an imperfect thing. It's not it's what you can do that day, that place, that moment. Sometimes it's just the radicalism of having your joy, despite a society that didn't want you to have it. Mm-hmm. That for those of us, it's funny, people always say, oh, they're so humble, that's such a compliment in certain white worlds. Well, when you've been a Black person that's batched down, I don't think actually I'm interested in any more humble Black children. To say praise someone for being humble is a very white and male perspective. Yes, maybe there are a lot of people who need to be humble, who come from certain categories of people. Some people need to be empowered and have some Detroit chin up swagger and to be proud of themselves despite. So we all have to look at where the balance in our lives in any particular moment, particular hour, particular year is. And I think and I'm so glad actually that, what I love about Ashtin is that she's disrupting because she's a scholar and she is also a pragmatist in a world that has been given no value to, which is the world of, frankly, hospitality workers. And that she's great mind and spirit and body, and that she is defining herself, period, and allowing her and defining herself openly in many different spheres. And she is up in Vermont as opposed to being down south where you might expect her to be. She is locating herself where she wishes to be with a variety of allies. And I do think that is for all of the way forward, is to be individually rigorous and collective and recognize all the good people. I know the good people is they do think they have some responsibility for some of this mess, even if it's just not being radical enough that day. The people who say, I am not a racist, I actually can say, if you can make some statement like that, you clearly are using racist privilege and have no idea of how racist you are. That if you can make the statement, I am not a racist.
If you can make the statement, I'm not a racist, you also aren't concerned with whose feelings you hurt. And so I think like the biggest thing that people need to realize is that being called a racist isn't the worst thing in the world. How you respond to that, though, either discounts or affirms that notion. And I think the biggest issue is that a lot of white people are more concerned with how they are perceived than who they are in relation and how they are treating people in the moment. And to all of the videos have not stopped for years. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, those are our reckoning moments. But let's also note that this isn't a new trend. It took a pandemic. It took people being laid off from work, sitting in a house and having to be quarantined to draw them to something that Black people have been screaming about for years. That is a conversation about how you, as Colin has been saying, what stories you listen to and what stories you want. But it is more than ever a byproduct of what redlining has done to this country and how segregation, even if Jim Crow is over, has made our communities homogenous, not only in terms of who we see, but who we hear and who we recognize and who we believe
and who we
empathize with.
I want to raise this one up and this is one of my saints. This is a young lady called Tanya Blanding. She was murdered in her home in 1967, the summer of 1967. She was 4, I was about 8. I've thought about this young woman by a Michigan State trooper in her own dining room. I have thought about her every week, really since then, because she was on Euclid. My cousin lived on Euclid. I have played in front of her house. That in fact, a little girl, I didn't personally know her, but a little girl I had seen was shot down in her own home, was dramatically of concern to me. But so when people are Breonna Taylor, we've been waiting since before. This is nice, way before. This is not recent. But what is recent in this moment of reckoning, somehow, for those factors you said, something has come together that the country, that people are actually noting. That there are two different Americas. Right now, problem I have with some of my most liberal, thoughtful, progressive friends is I haven't been out of my house, but as I said, this small number of times since March 10th. That's part of that statistic. 1 in every 1,000 Black people have died of COVID. I have so many progressive friends who are even having political organizing rallies and doing this and that, and they're going off on vacation with their children because they said, you don't understand, Alice, because you don't have young children. And I say, you don't understand if we all stayed together and stayed in for 5 weeks, that basically I am in prison and I have not done, and not that I think anyone should be in prison, but I am on lockdown because a lot of progressive people cannot stop traveling, going on vacation, and fraternizing with their friends and doing these things that they don't want because they're not hard hit. They don't know as many people as I know who have died of COVID.
And that is what Connor said. That is American exceptionalism. Right then, that is the display. That is the most apt display for it. That we would call people to go back to work rather than keep them safe is the best example what we have to have. But also that it requires you to see death for it to have value speaks volumes about what we value in this country, right? You know, I am a privileged Black person, and I can say that I've lost 6 people to COVID. 6. I'm a privileged Black person who family has access, and I've still lost 6 people in my family. I have lost in New Orleans. I have lost friends. I have lost former employees, right? And it's hard for people to understand this, but the issue is, why must we understand to empathize? This is the biggest thing, is that we will never be able, me as a Black woman, as much as I would like to, I will never understand the plight of a Black trans woman. Maybe points, we can compare points, I will never understand. But my understanding should not diminish their ability to be humanized and to live in a world that keeps them safe. Mm-hmm. And I think what we have to talk about is American exceptionalism states that only certain people get to be safe. That is only a human right for a few.
Yeah.
Just like monuments. Yeah.
It's that way that scarcity, the system of scarcity, is bound up in race, and how race has been used to hoard those resources, those opportunities, that access to healthcare, to schools, to houses, to jobs, and the way that that's built wealth for some at the expense of others.
Yeah. I want to thank you guys so much. We are over our time. I wish we could keep going. There's so many things to say. I want to thank all three of you, Connor Towne O'Neill, Alice Randall, and especially Ashtin Berry, for the stories you tell, the narratives you bring to light, the humanity you bring to your work, the creativity, the joy, the lessons that you teach us, how history can impact our future. Thank you all so much for your work and your time. And yeah, thank you everybody who's watching and Southern Festival of Books for having us. We're very grateful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.